Indian companies have just been very, very profitable. And while it's been seen as somewhat of a recent phenomenon, certainly in the COVID and post-COVID era, you've seen India really outperform, but it actually even goes back much, much further than that. If you go back over the last 10, 20 years, India has been one of the best performing markets, and it really is just the growth, like I've said, and the fact that the Indian stock market also does reflect that growth, which is somewhat different from many other major economies.
How much of the recent gains have to do with inflows diverting from China?
That's a good question. And while there's not great data on global flows to really kind of narrow it down, from what we can see, it does appear actually not that much. So it's often kind of picked up as a theme that you're seeing outflows out of China, inflows into India. But when we look at what is actually happening in the data, actually you're seeing a lot of participation from domestic Indian investors. So domestic savers, domestic households are actually driving a lot of the upside that we've seen, and it's actually not that much foreign flows. And on China, we're actually not seeing that much outflows either.
The latest world outlook from the IMF has India's projected growth at 6.8%, very strong by world standards. What is that likely to mean for future performance of India's equities?
Yeah, I think that's where we kind of predicate our positive view on, is that, like I've said, you've seen Indian stock markets really reflect economic growth, in that you've seen high nominal growth, and that has translated to higher corporate revenues, higher earnings. And so then on a forward-looking basis, if you expect growth to continue, both that 6.8 number, but then even when you add inflation to get what's called nominal growth, you get even a higher number. And that's generally the number that matters for corporate revenue. So if you expect growth to remain fairly high and India to be an outperformer in that growth aspect, then on a forward-looking basis, you could expect Indian equities to reflect that growth and to continue to perform well. And I think that's why many, including us, have a positive, both near-term and especially long-term view of the Indian markets.
What are the risks to that outlook?
Yeah, there are a number. I think some of the positives you point to, when people think about India, they think about demographics and the increasing share of labor supply. They think about the infrastructure build out, and they think about growing productivity. Now, every positive is somewhat of a double-edged sword. Of course, you have this growing labor supply, but they will need to find good, productive jobs, create good, productive jobs for this growing labor force. They have to build out more infrastructure, but that risks creating more debt or more fiscal debt. So I think how they handle the reform agenda, how they handle some of these potential positives, and make sure they don't turn into a negative, I think those are some of the key factors to watch.
How quickly is that reform taking place? How quickly is the country urbanising? And do you believe its future growth target does rest on a big shift from farm to factory?
Yes, I'd say, frankly, it does rest on that shift. You can see that the agricultural population is double really what China's is. Urbanization is half of what China's is. And so there are a lot of these assumptions around moving workers from the farm into more productive factory jobs, urbanizing the country. That trend should continue, but it's not going to happen at a very rapid pace. These take time. It took decades for that to occur in China, so it is still very much part of the long-term outlook for India.
Is the time coming when we will consider India is, as China has been in the past, the engine for global growth?
I think so. That will certainly take time. And I think even how China is viewed as the engine is somewhat misconstrued. But I think as India shifts towards more manufacturing, as they shift to building out more infrastructure, they're going to consume more from the rest of the world, whether that's iron ore from Australia or copper from South America. And as they continue to consume more, invest more, India will be a key driver of global growth. And so I think, yes, it will emerge as a key driver, not the key driver. Certainly it's going to take a lot of time, but a very key driver of the global economy.
And so where do you see India's brightest opportunities, and indeed opportunities for Australia in terms of trading with India?
I think from an investment perspective, you are seeing broad growth. And so that tends to help financials, that tends to help banks, it tends to help sectors, consumer sectors like autos or even healthcare. But I think as we think long term, you're likely to see more investment in infrastructure, definitely more investment in manufacturing, and even some upgrades in terms of digitalization and investment in manufacturing and EVs. So you have both short term and long term opportunities. I think from a Australia perspective, similar to the growth in Australian exports to China, you're likely to see very similar. Australia exports a lot of education and a lot of tourism on the services side. Export consumer commodities, beef and wine as taste exchange, and iron ore and other commodities as infrastructure investment grows. And so I think there are a lot of opportunities for Australia to continue to grow and grow in exports in line with India's growth.
Narendra Modi is currently seeking a third term in office. Are there implications of a long tenure on the economy, keeping in mind the Modi government is being accused of a number of anti-democratic practices by the opposition and indeed foreign media?
I think from a business perspective, from a markets perspective, when they look at India or they look at really any, say, developing economy, often continuity is viewed favorably, especially when there is a reform agenda in place. I think governments, countries that change the government too frequently or see a lot of volatility or uncertainty around that, that tends to somewhat spook markets. Investors don't like that uncertainty, and so that continuity is viewed as a positive, certainly by markets. And the fact that the Modi government has been engaged in this reform agenda aimed at boosting manufacturing, urbanization, increasing productivity, digitalization across the economy, and the expectation that that agenda could continue, that is also viewed as a positive. So I think markets are kind of pricing in that continuity of that agenda.
Okay, good to speak to you. Alex Wolf, thank you.
Right.